The wind had a way of sneaking through the trees, cutting across the pine-scented valleys of northern Maine like a cold blade. Even in early October, the nights had started to sting, a reminder that winter wasn't politely scheduled. It arrived on its own terms. Robert Bobby Calhoun knew that better than most. At 73, with a weathered face lined from decades of hunting in these forests, he moved through the underbrush with a deliberate grace. Every step, every snap of a twig under his worn boots, spoke of a lifetime spent understanding the land's secrets. Bobby wasn't wealthy. He had a small cabin near Moosehead Lake, an old beat-up truck, and a dog named Huck who had been with him longer than most of his friends had. But what he lacked in material things, he made up for with experience, intuition, and an uncanny ability to survive when others would have frozen. It wasn't that he liked the cold, he respected it. It demanded attention, awareness, humility. He'd been wandering the forest since dawn, rifle slung loosely across his shoulder, checking traps he had set weeks earlier. The air was crisp, and frost clung to the edges of the fallen leaves like tiny diamonds. There was a silence in the woods that few people appreciated. The hush of snow waiting to fall, the stillness of trees standing guard, the occasional caw of a crow that felt less like a bird and more like a messenger. Bobby breathed it in and smiled. This was his element, more comforting than the warmth of a fire or the familiarity of his cabin walls. Yet this season was different. The weather forecasts had been warning of an early, brutal winter, one that could trap the unprepared and turn a simple walk in the woods into a deadly mistake. He had survived harsher storms before, yes, but age had a way of wearing down even the most resilient bodies. His bones ached more, his reflexes weren't as quick, and the nights in his old cabin felt colder than they used to. But Bobby had a secret. It wasn't just a cabin, it was a shelter, a marvel of practical design and intuition hidden deep in the forest where no casual hiker would ever stumble upon it. He had built it decades ago, back when he was younger and the cold didn't bother him so much. Most people, he figured, would scoff if he told them. Why bother hiding a shelter? They'd ask. The truth was simple. This place wasn't about convenience or bragging rights. It was about survival. And every winter, it proved itself again. He ducked under a low-hanging branch, brushing snowflakes from his shoulders, and followed a faint trail of blazed marks on the trees, a breadcrumb trail he had made himself years ago. "Almost there, Huck," he muttered, his voice raspy from the cold air. The dog, a mix of border collie and something indefinable, trotted faithfully at his side, ears perked, tail low but alert. They moved quietly, each step calculated, until the trees thinned, revealing a slight depression in the ground. Bobby paused, surveying the spot. Hidden cleverly behind a wall of evergreens, the entrance was subtle, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. He reached down, brushing aside pine needles, and pulled a camouflaged flap of bark aside. The opening was small, low, just enough for a man to squeeze through. A gust of wind rushed past him, carrying the scent of snow and pine resin. Inside, the air was warmer, surprisingly so, a dry heat that clung to his skin like an old friend. The shelter wasn't fancy, it never needed to be, but it was precise. The walls, layered with insulation from years of trial and error, held heat like a stubborn ember. There was a small stove, handcrafted from repurposed metal, with a chimney venting smoke discreetly through a hollowed-out tree trunk. Beds were simple, raised platforms lined with furs and wool blankets that had been passed down through generations. The floor, covered in thick mats, absorbed the cold instead of reflecting it. Bobby always joked that a person could survive a blizzard in there without feeling a thing, and most nights he was far from joking. Huck shook himself, sending a scattering of snowflakes flying. Bobby laughed softly, a low sound that seemed to belong more to the forest than to him. "Don't get too comfy, old boy, we've got work to do." Winter was coming fast, and with it, the harsh tests of the wild. Bobby had been tracking deer and setting snares, yes, but the real preparation wasn't about hunting. It was about survival. He checked the stove, lit a small fire, and began methodically unpacking supplies he had cached months earlier. Canned goods, dried meat, fresh water from a nearby stream he had dug a protected channel to. Firewood carefully stacked. Everything had been calculated to keep him alive for weeks if the snow cut him off from the outside world. As the fire grew, throwing warm light across the walls, Bobby allowed himself a rare moment to lean back and think. He remembered the first time he had built the S. Helter decades ago, he had been younger, cocky, eager to prove himself against the winter's fury. That first storm had been merciless, freezing him to the bone before he even finished the walls. But he learned. Every year after, he refined, adjusted, improved. By the time he reached his 60s, the shelter was nearly perfect, a fortress that hugged the earth, blending into the forest so completely that even seasoned hunters could walk past it a dozen times without noticing. Yet this season carried a weight he hadn't felt before. The storms weren't just early, they were fierce, unprecedented. The weather reports told stories of snowdrifts taller than cars, of highways buried under white mountains, of people stranded for days without food or heat. Bobby knew that many in town would be ill-prepared. They'd think a few blankets and a space heater could keep them safe. But he knew better. The forest didn't negotiate. It didn't care about convenience or comfort. Respect was earned, and the winter could take a man down in minutes if he let his guard down. Hours passed. Outside, the wind howled like a restless ghost, rattling branches and scattering snow across the forest floor. Inside, Bobby and Huck were safe, the world reduced to the flickering warmth of the fire and the rhythmic crackle of logs. Bobby thought about the neighbors, about the hunters and hikers who might be caught unaware in the weeks to come. He sipped from a thermos of black coffee, bitter and hot, letting the warmth seep into his bones. "Someday they'll know," he murmured, more to himself than to Huck. "They'll know why it pays to respect the land, why preparation matters." The dog yipped softly, as if agreeing, and Bobby allowed himself a small smile. He wasn't just surviving, he was ready. The forest could try to bury him, try to push him to his limits, but the shelter had kept him alive through worse, and it would do so again. Yet even in the warmth, a flicker of unease crept into his mind. The wind outside wasn't ordinary. There was a bite to it, a malicious tone that hinted the winter might test him harder than ever before. He shook the thought off, returning to his routine, checking traps, sharpening knives, ensuring the firewood was sufficient. Preparation was ritual, a way to anchor himself when nature became unpredictable. And then he heard it, a faint creaking, a whisper against the walls of the shelter, not the wind, not Huck, but something else. Bobby's heart skipped a beat, old instincts flaring to life. He reached for his rifle, even though he doubted anything would be there. The forest had a voice, and sometimes it carried warnings. But tonight the sound was fleeting, almost imagined. A trick of the storm, he told himself, yet his eyes scanned the shadows with unyielding focus. The night deepened. Snow began to fall in earnest, drifting lazily at first, then pounding like silver rain against the forest canopy. Bobby listened, attuned to every creak, every whisper of the wild. Survival wasn't just about shelter, it was about awareness, about anticipating danger before it arrived. Huck curled beside him, ears twitching, and Bobby finally allowed himself to relax, if only slightly. He fed the fire, adjusted the blankets, and let the warmth and the quiet wrap around him like an old friend. Out here in the heart of the Maine wilderness, life was simple and brutal. And as long as he respected the forest, followed its rules, and trusted the shelter he had built with his own hands, he knew he could survive anything the winter threw his way. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that this year, the winter might have more in store than even he had prepared for. A storm was coming. Not just any storm, a winter that could test the limits of even the most experienced. And Bobby, for all his knowledge and foresight, was about to find out just how much a man could endure. The forest waited, the wind waited, and somewhere beneath the snow, the hidden shelter stood silently, ready to defend its keeper. The first full week of November arrived like a predator stalking its prey. The sun barely crested the horizon before the wind was tearing through the trees, whipping snowflakes into jagged slashes that stung exposed skin. Bobby's routine had shifted. Gone were the carefree mornings of checking traps at leisure. Every step now required calculation. Every decision carried consequences. Even a minor mistake could mean frostbite, or worse. Huck, ever faithful, seemed energized by the cold. The dog darted between trees, sniffing the snow, chasing phantom scents as if aware that the forest itself had changed. Bobby often watched him and marveled at the resilience of animals. Unlike humans, they didn't complain. They adapted, survived, thrived. And maybe that was the lesson, he thought. Survival wasn't about brute strength. It was about understanding, patience, and respect. The traps had been fruitful, but not as much as he needed. The deer were smarter this year, skittish from the early frost, avoiding familiar trails. Food supplies inside the shelter were sufficient for now, but he knew that the real test was sustaining warmth over days when blizzards made movement impossible. He decided to venture farther than usual, toward the northern ridge, where he remembered seeing a cluster of spruce trees that could provide both cover and a vantage point to scout the forest. The hike was arduous. The snow was already knee-deep in places, and a bitter wind sliced through his coat. Bobby's breath formed clouds that vanished instantly into the gray sky. He paused at a ridge and looked down into a valley layered in white, the frozen river below glinting like a fractured mirror. From this height, the forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of white and green, each ridge and hollow a potential trap or refuge. "Careful, old man," he muttered to himself, tightening the strap on his rifle. Huck, undeterred, leapt ahead, paws crunching through snow. But even the dog hesitated when a sudden gust swept through the ridge, forcing them to hunker low behind a snow-laden boulder. Bobby's heart thumped, not with fear exactly, but with respect. Nature was relentless, and the forest didn't forgive pride. By midday, he reached the spruce cluster. The trees here were dense, their boughs heavy with snow, forming a natural canopy that blocked much of the wind. Bobby took a moment to catch his breath and surveyed the surrounding area. Tracks in the snow were faint, hares, foxes, maybe a wandering deer, but he noticed something else, something unusual. Faint human footprints, partially buried by fresh snow, leading toward the west. He froze. Human tracks in this part of the forest weren't unusual in summer, but in early winter they suggested someone was out here despite the storm warnings. Could be a lost hiker, could be a hunter, or could be someone desperate, unprepared, looking for shelter. Bobby's instincts flared. He had seen too many accidents, too many tragedies caused by people underestimating the cold. "Stay close," he whispered to Huck, who immediately pressed against his leg. They followed the tracks cautiously, moving through thick underbrush, stepping over frozen roots and branches. The footprints led to a small clearing where the snow was disturbed in ways that suggested a struggle, or at least frustration. Broken branches, footprints circling back on themselves, and a thin, tattered scarf snagged on a bush. Bobby's chest tightened. He knelt, brushing snow from the scarf. It was faded red, frayed at the edges, stiff with frost. Someone had been here recently. Maybe they were still close. Maybe they were in trouble. He scanned the tree line, rifle at the ready, eyes narrowing. Then he heard it, a weak, distant shout carried faintly by the wind. Bobby's heart skipped. He didn't hesitate. "Huck, come on," he said, and the dog bounded ahead, ears forward, nose to the ground. They followed the sound, pushing through the snow, until they stumbled upon a young man, shivering violently, kneeling in the snow. He looked barely 20, clothes soaked, gloves useless, teeth chattering. Bobby immediately recognized the signs of hypothermia: pale skin, sluggish movements, slow responses. The kid's backpack lay discarded a few feet away, half buried in snow. "You're lucky I found you," Bobby said, kneeling beside him. "Name?" Ethan," the boy stammered. His lips were blue, his voice faint. "I got lost, my car snowed in." Bobby didn't wait. He instructed Ethan to grab his arms, and with Huck's encouraging nudge, he helped the boy to his feet. The forest was unforgiving, but the shelter wasn't far. It was about 20 minutes through treacherous terrain, and Bobby moved with deliberate care, steadying Ethan when his legs buckled. Every gust of wind that hit them made him grit his teeth, but he refused to panic. Panic killed faster than frostbite. By the time they reached the hidden entrance, Ethan was trembling violently. Bobby got him inside, immediately shedding wet layers and wrapping him in blankets. The stove crackled, warm light spreading across the shelter's walls. Bobby poured hot tea from a thermos and handed it to Ethan, who sipped shakily, eyes wide with gratitude and fear. "You're lucky," Bobby said again, more firmly this time. "This forest doesn't forgive mistakes." He studied the boy closely. Ethan wasn't a bad kid, just inexperienced, naive, unprepared for what nature demanded. And yet in this tiny shelter they were both safe for now. Hours passed. Bobby monitored the fire, checked the stove, and made a small meal of preserved meat and bread. Ethan, finally warmed, began to talk. His story was fragmented, panic spilling over in patches. He had gone out with friends for a short hike near Moosehead Lake, had separated from them during a sudden snowstorm and gotten turned around. The map on his phone was useless. The battery had died hours ago. He had and dared blindly, trying to find a road, a sign of civilization, anything. "I thought I was done for," he said, voice shaking. "I didn't know what to do." Bobby nodded solemnly. "Most people don't. You're lucky, kid. You respect the forest, you survive. You ignore it, you die." The night deepened, and the storm outside intensified. Snow battered the walls of the shelter, wind rattling every branch and limb. Bobby could hear the forest's fury, a low, omnipresent roar that pressed against the walls like it wanted to intrude. Yet inside, the warmth held steady, blankets snug, stove working perfectly, food and water secured. The shelter was more than walls. It was a lifeline, a testament to decades of trial, error, and understanding the unforgiving rhythms of winter. Ethan, exhausted, finally curled up under a thick wool blanket, eyes wide but slowly closing. Bobby watched him for a moment, then checked his traps in the back corner, careful, methodical, never letting his attention waver even for a second. The boy would live, yes, but he had been naive, lucky, untested. Bobby had survived decades by paying attention to the smallest details, by never assuming nature would give him mercy. A knock on the wooden wall, a soft thump barely audible, made Bobby's head snap toward the door. His fingers tightened on the rifle. The wind, another tree branch, or someone else in trouble. He leaned closer, listening. Nothing, just the wind, maybe a branch shifting, but the forest was clever, deceptive. One moment it could lull a man into a false sense of security, the next it could strike. He shook the thought off. For now, Ethan was safe. The fire burned steadily. Huck lay beside the boy, warm and watchful. Bobby allowed himself to breathe, though the tension didn't fully leave him. He knew the winter was just beginning. And as much as the shelter protected him, as much as it had saved him through decades of brutal storms, he understood that this year might demand more than it had ever demanded before. Tomorrow they would need to move carefully, assess the traps, and ration supplies. The storm wouldn't ease, and the forest's trials were far from over. But tonight they survived. And in a forest that often claimed those unprepared, survival, even for a few hours, was worth every ounce of effort, every bead of sweat, every careful calculation. Bobby glanced at Ethan, sleeping fitfully under the blankets, and muttered to himself, "You'll learn soon enough, kid. Winter doesn't care who you are, it only cares if you respect it." Outside, the wind screamed. Snow buried the world in white. But inside, the old hunter's secret shelter held firm, a beacon of warmth, resilience, and quiet defiance against the harshest of winters. And deep down, Bobby felt the unmistakable pull of anticipation. A storm this big, this early, had a story to tell. And he intended to see it through, one frozen, grueling day at a time. By the third week of November, the storm had become relentless, a white wall that pressed against the forest like an angry sea. The wind howled continuously, rattling the trees, snapping branches, and driving sheets of snow through every gap and hollow. Temperatures had plummeted far below freezing, and the kind of cold that gnawed at bones and turned breath into frostbite lingered day and night. Roads were impassable, towns were cut off, and radio signals barely penetrated the thick, frozen forest. Inside the shelter, Bobby moved with practiced precision. He stoked the fire, checked the stove, and rationed food. Every movement was deliberate, every thought calculated. Huck padded silently around the room, alert but calm, sensing the tension in the air. Ethan, now fully clothed in dry layers Bobby had lent him, helped where he could, carrying firewood and refilling water containers from the small cistern they had dug months ago. But even in the warmth of the shelter, the fear of what lay beyond its walls gnawed at them. Bobby knew that surviving a storm for a day was one thing, surviving a week, maybe two, was another entirely. And the storm showed no sign of relenting. Outside, the snowdrifts were already waist-deep, making travel nearly impossible, even for someone with Bobby's skill. On the fourth night, a sharp knock at the shelter's entrance jolted Bobby from a restless sleep. He froze, ears straining. The sound repeated, this time more insistent, almost desperate. "Stay here," he instructed Ethan, his voice low but firm. Huck growled softly. Bobby moved to the entrance, rifle in hand, heart pounding, not from fear, but from the instinctual thrill of facing danger head-on. Pulling back the camouflaged flap, Bobby was met with a young woman, shivering violently, snow clinging to her hair and coat, eyes wide with panic. She looked no older than 25, pale from cold, lips blue. "Please help me," she whispered. I got lost, car buried. Bobby nodded sharply, recognizing the signs of severe exposure. Ray, inside, he said, guiding her in. Move carefully, don't try to talk too much yet, you're lucky I found you. Huck sniffed the woman, then settled close, as if offering silent reassurance. Bobby stripped her of wet layers, wrapped her in blankets, and handed her a mug of hot tea. Her hands shook violently as she sipped, and Bobby could see the frostbite beginning to form on her fingers. You're going to be all right, he said firmly. Just stay warm, don't panic. Ethan watched nervously, clearly both fascinated and terrified by the scene unfolding. Bobby's calm was a study in contrast to the storm outside. He moved with efficiency, checking her pulse, her breathing, and the tips of her fingers and toes. The storm wasn't going to let them rest easily tonight, that was certain. Hours passed. The wind screamed outside, hammering the shelter's walls. Bobby could hear the trees groaning under the weight of the snow. Outside, the storm was a living thing, violent, unpredictable. He couldn't see the world beyond the shelter, but he felt its fury pressing in, threatening to erase any trace of civilization from the valley below. And then came the sound that made his stomach drop, the unmistakable crack of a tree limb breaking, much too close, followed by a rush of snow and debris that shook the shelter. Bobby cursed under his breath. One misstep from nature, one branch or tree falling in the wrong place, and their sanctuary could become a tomb. He moved quickly, reinforcing the weaker sections of the walls with extra logs and bracing the roof as best he could. Ethan and the woman, now introduced as Clara, watched anxiously. Bobby's face was set, a mask of determination and focus. Years of experience had taught him that panic was contagious, and there was no room for it tonight, not with lives on the line. Morning came, but the storm showed no mercy. Visibility was nearly zero. The snow had drifted so high that the shelter looked like a mound of white, barely distinguishable from the surrounding forest. The temperature inside remained tolerable, but the cold seeped into every corner, reminding them that this was not a place for comfort, only survival. Bobby decided they needed to check the perimeter. He couldn't risk waiting for the storm to end, not when supplies were finite and the forest demanded vigilance. Bundled in layers, he led Huck and Ethan out first, breaking a path through the waist-deep snow to survey the area. The wind cut through his coat like knives, frost forming on his beard. Every step was a struggle, every breath a burning effort. They found evidence that terrified him, more stranded travelers, footprints frozen in the snow, signs of desperation, abandoned backpacks, torn clothing, footprints leading nowhere. The storm had claimed countless others who weren't prepared. And Bobby realized with grim certainty that this was only the beginning. Returning to the shelter, they found Clara already awake, attempting to help with chores despite her weakened state. Bobby shook his head. Sit, rest, you're no good to anyone if you collapse out there. The days that followed blurred together. Snow fell without pause. Wind gusts threatened to collapse trees onto the shelter. Hunger and fatigue pressed against them. Bobby rationed food carefully, melting snow for water, ensuring the fire never died. He drilled survival practices into Ethan and Clara, how to monitor body heat, how to move safely outside, how to listen to the forest. Every lesson was urgent, every moment weighted with consequence. But the real test came on the fifth night. The wind intensified beyond anything Bobby had experienced. Snow whirled in whiteout conditions, and a low, rumbling groan echoed through the forest. A massive tree, weakened by frost and age, began to tilt toward the shelter. Bobby's heart pounded. Huck Ethan inside now, he shouted. They scrambled in just as the tree crashed against the side of the shelter, splintering wood and sending a cascade of snow inside. The walls groaned but held. The fire sputtered, but Bobby managed to reignite it, checking frantically for structural damage. They huddled together, exhausted, shaken, but alive. Bobby's hands ached from reinforcing the walls, his face streaked with soot and sweat. He looked at Ethan and Clara, both wide-eyed, trembling but conscious. This is why preparation matters, he said quietly, almost to himself. This is why respect matters. The storm raged on, but the shelter held firm. It wasn't just a physical structure. It was a testament to decades of knowledge, instinct, and respect for the land. Without it, they wouldn't have stood a chance. That night, Bobby sat quietly watching the fire, listening to the wind's fury. He knew the storm wasn't over, that the forest had more tests to throw their way. But for the first time since it began, he allowed himself a measure of pride. Not arrogance, not bravado, pride in knowing that his years of experience, his careful attention to detail, and his unwavering respect for nature had saved lives. Outside, the storm howled, indifferent and relentless. But inside, 3 humans and 1 faithful dog had survived, bound together by necessity, trust, and the unyielding strength of a hidden shelter built by a man who understood the unforgiving winter better than anyone. Bobby knew the coming days would test them further, but for now, they were alive. And in a world where survival was never guaranteed, that was victory enough. Yet as he stared into the dancing flames, a chill ran down his spine. He could feel it, a warning from the forest itself. The storm was far from over, and nature had one final challenge waiting for them, something that would push even Bobby to the limits of endurance. The morning after the 5th night was deceptively calm. The wind had softened, though the air remained sharp and biting. Snow lay in thick, unbroken layers, sparkling like crushed diamonds beneath the pale winter sun. The storm had spent itself, or so it seemed, leaving a world transformed, quiet, white, and deceptively serene. Inside the shelter, Bobby moved with a careful efficiency, checking supplies, reinforcing the stove, and tending to the small fire. Ethan and Clara, now more accustomed to the rhythm of survival, helped with water and firewood. Huck padded between them, his fur dusted with frost but eyes bright with alertness. For the first time in days, Bobby allowed himself to pause and take stock. They had survived. The storm had been brutal, relentless, and unforgiving, yet the shelter had held. Not a single wall had failed. Not a single life had been lost. Bobby's decades of preparation, his meticulous knowledge of the forest, had triumphed against one of the harshest winters in memory. Ethan stirred from a blanket near the fire, rubbing his eyes. I never thought I'd make it," he admitted, voice raw. "I didn't even know how to survive out here. I was so unprepared." Bobby nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Most people aren't prepared. Most people don't realize that winter doesn't care about excuses. You've learned something now, though. That counts." Clara, wrapped in layers, looked at him with a mixture of awe and gratitude. I don't know how to thank you. If you hadn't found me." Her voice broke, but Bobby waved her off gently. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You survived because you stayed alive. That's your part of it. Now we need to get home safely." The trio set about clearing a narrow path through the snow, moving cautiously toward the main trail Bobby knew would eventually lead them back to civilization. It was slow going, snow up to their knees in places, fallen branches, hidden ice patches, but Bobby's steady guidance kept them moving without incident. As they descended into the valley, the devastation of the storm became apparent. Trees had snapped under the weight of snow, entire sections of forest flattened like matchsticks. Tracks of lost animals were frozen into the snow, some incomplete, suggesting that survival had been precarious for many creatures. Bobby's heart tightened. He knew that countless humans hadn't been as fortunate as they had been. Hours passed, and the forest slowly opened onto a snow-covered road, partially cleared by a plow that had come through overnight. Beyond it lay the faint outlines of cabins and vehicles buried under the white blanket. The first signs of life outside the forest felt almost surreal after days of isolation. Ethan and Clara slowed as they spotted smoke rising from chimneys in the distance. Tears streaked down Ethan's cheeks, a mixture of relief and disbelief. I can't believe it," he murmured. "We made it." Bobby's eyes softened, but he didn't relax just yet. "Not until you're fully safe," he said. They trudged the last stretch, boots crunching in the deep snow, hearts pounding with each step closer to warmth, food, and shelter that didn't depend solely on survival skills. Finally, they reached the first cabin at the edge of the cleared road. A neighbor, bundled in a thick parka, stared in astonishment at the trio emerging from the forest. "You made it through?" he asked, voice trembling. "I thought no one could survive out there in that storm." Bobby gave a small nod, voice quiet but firm. "We did, and we survived because we respected the land, because we prepared. Not everyone is so lucky." Ethan and Clara, shivering but safe, were led inside, offered hot soup, blankets, and medical attention. Bobby lingered at the edge of the cabin, looking back toward the forest. The hidden shelter, buried under snow, stood silently, unchanged, unyielding, and ready to protect anyone wise enough to find it and respect it. For Bobby, the experience left more than physical marks. He felt the familiar thrill of survival, the deep satisfaction of knowing that knowledge, preparation, and respect could stand against nature's fury. But he also felt a surge of responsibility. He had saved lives this winter, not through luck, but through the years of patience, experience, and careful planning. And he knew that many others would not be so fortunate without guidance. Later, as he returned to the shelter to check that it had weathered the storm fully intact, Bobby allowed himself a rare smile. The stove still glowed warmly, the walls were firm, and Huck circled him like a shadow, tail wagging. The shelter had endured, and so had he. It was more than a structure. It was a legacy of survival, a promise that no matter how fierce the winter, preparation and respect could defy it. That evening, sitting by the fire, Bobby thought about the storm, about the countless others caught in it, and about the two young people he had saved. He realized that survival wasn't just about knowing the land. It was about teaching, sharing wisdom, and helping others understand that the forest, the cold, and the snow were not enemies if treated with humility and care. Clara and Ethan returned to their families in the following days, carrying stories of survival, of a hidden shelter, and of an old hunter whose knowledge and foresight had spared them from the worst. Their lives were forever changed, as were the lives of those who would hear their tale. Bobby remained in his forest, tending to his shelter, preparing for the next winter, and watching over the woods he had learned to respect more than any person, more than any threat, and more than any fear. The storm had tested him, tested his shelter, tested his patience, and tested his resolve. And through it all, he had survived, not through luck, not through force, but through understanding, through respect, through preparation. As the sun set over the snow-blanketed forest, casting long shadows across the frozen pines, Bobby sat quietly by his fire, Huck resting at his feet. Outside, the winter was still harsh, still unforgiving, but inside the shelter there was warmth, safety, and the quiet triumph of a man who had mastered the art of surviving the impossible. And in the silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of his companions, Bobby whispered to the forest, a promise as old as the snow. "I'll be ready, always." The forest seemed to answer with a gentle gust of wind, as if acknowledging the pact. And in the heart of the wilderness, beneath the weight of snow and the bite of winter, the secret shelter remained, a fortress, a refuge, and a testament to the power of knowledge, preparation, and respect. Winter would come again, storms would rage. But for Bobby Calhoun, survival was not just a hope, it was a certainty.